What if I told you that behind the peaceful streets of Hong Kong, in a quiet neighborhood where kids play after school and grandparents wait patiently at the gate, a nightmare was silently taking shape? This isn't the plot of a crime movie. This is a real story. A story of jealousy, betrayal, and a decision so cruel, it would leave a city in shock. On a warm evening in August 2005, a 7-year-old boy walked home from school with his grandmother. It was supposed to be just another normal day. But within minutes, it would turn into one of Hong Kong's most chilling true crime cases. Two strangers appeared out of nowhere, dressed in black, wearing masks. Before anyone could understand what was happening, the boy was attacked in broad daylight, right in front of his home. Why would anyone do this to a child? The answer would take detectives through a twisted web of family drama, secrets, and a dark plan carefully hidden behind a smile. What they would uncover was something no one could have imagined. This is the true crime story of Chan Ho Yin, a case that shook a city and left behind a lesson we cannot afford to ignore. In the late afternoon of August 25, 2005, the streets of Lam Muk Shu village in Hong Kong wore the peaceful mask of routine. Commuters strolled home, children's laughter echoed between apartment blocks, and life unfolded with the kind of gentle repetition that breeds a sense of safety. Among the people weaving through the crowd was a 7-year-old boy named Chan Ho Yin, holding his grandmother's hand after a long day of school and extra classes. They were just minutes away from home, just a few quiet steps from warmth and familiarity. But fate doesn't knock when it arrives. It crashes. Without warning, two figures cloaked in black emerged from the shadows. Their faces hidden behind masks, they moved fast, too fast. One grabbed the grandmother with chilling precision, holding her back like a scene out of a rehearsed performance. The other went straight for the boy, throwing him to the ground with brute force. What came next shattered the calm of the neighborhood. A sharp object flashed in the air, and chaos erupted. Screams tore through the street. Bystanders froze, then rushed to help. Some shouted, others tried to intervene. But within seconds, the attackers dropped their weapon and vanished into the crowd, slipping away like phantoms toward a nearby school. It was over as quickly as it began. But the silence that followed wasn't peace, it was horror. Ho Yin lay on the pavement, motionless and covered in blood. His grandmother, paralyzed with shock, sobbed beside him. Strangers formed a circle, someone called for help, others used anything they could, scarves, tissues, desperation, to try and stop the bleeding. When the ambulance arrived, time became a blur. Ho Yin was taken to the hospital with a city holding its breath. The doctor's report painted a picture no child should ever be part of. His right arm had been severely injured. Muscles torn apart. Nerves damaged. The damage wasn't just physical, it was symbolic. Someone had targeted a child with intent, and the motive wasn't random. Hong Kong, a city used to the unexpected, stood still. This wasn't just another crime. This was a statement. And behind the chilling statement was a secret buried in family shadows, about to be pulled into the light. The city was still reeling when a quiet but alarming detail surfaced, one that had been buried in paperwork, dismissed as unimportant. About 6 weeks before the brutal attack on Ho Yin, there had been another incident. Early in the morning, around 7:35 a.m., the boy and his grandmother were leaving their apartment to attend class, just like any other day. But on that morning, two unfamiliar men were seen loitering near the entrance. As the pair stepped outside, one of the men suddenly charged forward and kicked the young boy. It was fast, blunt, and frightening. Thankfully, Ho Yin was not seriously hurt, and the men quickly fled the scene before anyone could react. His grandmother, shaken, immediately reported the incident to the police. But the case was brushed off as an isolated street altercation, an unfortunate but random event. No follow-up. No deeper look. No warning bells. Now, with Ho Yin fighting for his future in a hospital bed, that first attack took on a darker meaning. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't random. Someone had been watching the boy, tracking his daily life, waiting for the right moment. The unanswered question echoed louder than ever: who would want to hurt a child? And what kind of hatred could run deep enough to make them try twice? The investigation, once wide and uncertain, began to tighten its focus. Because if the attackers knew exactly when and where to strike, then the danger wasn't somewhere out there, it was coming from much closer than anyone had dared to imagine. As the investigation turned inward, the answers began to form not on the streets, but behind the closed doors of a broken home. Ho Yin, though just 7, had already lived through more emotional fractures than many do in a lifetime. His parents had divorced when he was barely a year old. His mother, overwhelmed and unprepared, left him behind, placing the weight of his care onto his aging grandmother. And so, In a small flat in Lamukshu village, the boy grew up, without parents, but with the steady warmth of a grandmother's love. Then came a shift. His father, Chan Ho Yin, remarried. His new wife, Man Yee, entered the picture with her own hopes, her own expectations. They soon had a child together, a new half-brother for Ho Yin. But instead of forming a family, the cracks widened. Ironically, or perhaps tragically, that new child was also sent to live with the grandmother. Man Yee chose to stay with her own parents, keeping her distance both physically and emotionally. The family structure became a patchwork of abandonment, of inconvenient ties held together by obligation rather than affection. What should have been a home became a pressure cooker of resentment and silence. And the deeper detectives dug, the more Man Yee's name began to appear, not just as a stepmother, but as a presence oddly detached and disturbingly calm in the wake of violence. Something about her didn't fit the image of a grieving family member. In fact, she barely fit in the family at all. Man Yee wasn't a villain at first glance. To the outside world, she was ordinary, quiet, even polite. She met Chan Ho Yin in 2002 while working at a sushi restaurant, and like many beginnings, theirs seemed sweet. She fell for his charm, his older calmness, and the security he seemed to offer. Even knowing he had a child didn't stop her. Perhaps she believed love could overcome the past. Perhaps she believed she could rewrite it. But love turned sour in ways no one predicted. In 2004, she became pregnant. What should have been joyful became a nightmare when she discovered she had contracted a sexually transmitted disease. She accused Ho Yin. He coldly denied everything, blamed her instead, and refused responsibility. She claimed he was her first. He insisted she was lying. Still, she stayed. Whether out of fear, desperation, or misguided loyalty, she stayed and carried the child. Ho Yin made promises. He would send Ho Yin to live with his birth mother, focus on their new family, give her the life she deserved. It was a promise that never came true. Ho Yin remained in the home, remained the sun in the spotlight, while Man Yee, now a mother herself, watched from the shadows. That broken promise became the seed of resentment. And over time, it grew roots. Every smile Ho Yin received, every time the grandmother prioritized him, Man Yee felt herself disappearing. Not just from her husband's heart, but from her own place in the family. She was the outsider. And Ho Yin? To her eyes, he wasn't just a child. He was the symbol of everything she had lost, and everything she would never have. After giving birth in early 2005, Man Yee should have felt joy, new life, a fresh chapter. But the reality was far colder. Her work was unstable, her financial security fragile, and worst of all, she felt invisible in her own family. Her newborn son, instead of being the center of attention, was left in the care of the same grandmother who raised Ho Yin. Day after day, she saw her baby treated like a second priority, while Ho Yin, the stepchild, seemed to receive all the warmth she so desperately craved. It gnawed at her. Slowly at first. But over time, the bitterness festered into obsession. She began to view Ho Yin not as a child, not even as a stepson, but as a rival. Every time he played too loudly with her infant, every time he got picked up from school, every time he smiled, it felt like an insult carved into her pride. She started to see things differently. Where others saw playful teasing between siblings, she saw dominance. Where others saw family, she saw betrayal. And then came the moment that broke her. One evening, she confronted her husband, voice trembling, eyes hollowed by resentment. "If you had to choose," she asked, "between me and your son, who would it be?" There was no hesitation in Chan Ho Yin's reply. "My son." It was a simple answer. Honest. But to Man Yee, it was a dagger to the heart. That night, something inside her cracked. The anger, the jealousy, the loneliness, it all turned inward, and then outward. She stopped seeing Ho Yin as a child at all. In her mind, he had become the reason her love was unreturned, her efforts unseen, her presence unwanted. And when emotions cross that fragile line into revenge, what follows is rarely rational. In her growing storm of resentment, Man Yee turned to a voice from her past, the kind of voice that doesn't offer comfort, but stokes the fire already burning. It belonged to Chan Ho Yin, her former boyfriend. Their relationship had long ended, but pain has a way of remembering who once held it. And Ho Yin, lost in his own spiral of disappointment and heartbreak, became the perfect mirror for her bitterness. They began talking again. Not just once or twice. Between July and early August, Man Yee and Chan Ho Yin exchanged nearly 200 calls, some long, others brief, but all of them feeding into a shared darkness. In these conversations, she laid bare her frustrations, Her belief that her son was being pushed aside, her anger toward the boy she blamed for her broken home. And at some point, talk turned into action. It started with a seemingly harmless request, "Teach him a lesson," she said. She offered money, not much at first, but enough to raise Ka-Fi's interest. He agreed. But he had no intention of doing it himself. Instead, he reached out to someone even more desperate, Lo Ka-ho, a teenager from a troubled background, hungry for easy cash and numb to consequences. The plan was set in motion. But there was one problem: neither of them had ever seen Chan Ho Yin. They didn't even know what he looked like. So Man Yee did something that would chill investigators later. She invited her stepson to dinner, staged a happy family meal, and snapped a photo with him. Not to remember the moment, but to mark him as a target. It was disturbingly methodical. After supplying Tang Ka-Fi with a photo of little Ho Yin, Man Yee stepped back into the shadows, letting the hands of others carry out her intentions. With a blurry image in hand, Ka-Fi passed the photo to Lo Ka-ho. What had started as vague resentment was now becoming logistics. Planning. Surveillance. They chose their first opportunity carefully, August 8, early morning. Just like the routine they tracked, Ho Yin and his grandmother stepped out of their building at 7:35 a.m. Lo Ka-ho was already waiting, nerves sharpened by adrenaline and a twisted sense of purpose. As the boy emerged, Lo rushed forward and kicked him hard. No words. No hesitation. Just a strike, then a quick retreat. Ho Yin was hurt, but not badly. Still, the act sent a wave of fear through the family. His grandmother screamed for help. The attackers disappeared into the streets. And though the incident was reported, it still wasn't connected to anything larger. Not yet. But Man Yee wasn't satisfied. A bruise wasn't enough. She believed pain had to be permanent to make a point. So she raised the price, offering 36,000 Hong Kong dollars for a much more vicious outcome. This time, she didn't want to scare Ho Yin. She wanted to destroy his right arm, ruin his future. Leave a scar no doctor could fix. Tang Ka-Fi accepted. He brought in more help, hired a driver, arranged new weapons, and even pulled in another teenager, Chan Ho-Yin, to make sure the job would be done cleanly. What was once a grudge had now evolved into a criminal enterprise, orchestrated with terrifying calm by a woman who, just months earlier, had cradled her own newborn child. August 25, 2005, the date marked in quiet horror. After weeks of planning, calls, and whispered instructions, the plan Man Yee paid for was finally set into motion. At 5:45 p.m., the streets of Lamukshu village looked just as they always did, calm, filled with the end-of-day shuffle. No one knew that a sinister countdown had begun. That a child was being hunted. The attackers moved like a well-practiced unit. Lo Ka-ho, the one chosen to strike, carried the weapon. Chan Ho-Yin, brought in for reinforcement, followed close behind. A hired driver waited nearby. Everything had been rehearsed: timing, location, escape. And then it happened. As Ho Yin walked home with his grandmother, chatting like any carefree child would, the two young men appeared from nowhere. Just like before, one restrained the grandmother. The other threw Ho Yin to the ground, this time with no hesitation, no warning, no second thoughts. A blade flashed in the fading sunlight. Screams erupted. Chaos swirled. But within moments, the attackers vanished into the crowd, shedding their dark clothes, wiping away blood, disappearing into the city like smoke. In their wake, they left a child bleeding, barely conscious, his future ripped open on the pavement. This was not a message. It was punishment. Later, it would be revealed that Man Yee had given clear instructions: make sure he can never use that arm again. It was precise, personal, and devastating. What no one knew at the time was that her money had paid for every second of it. From the taxi that drove them there, to the knife that cut through flesh, to the silence that followed. But silence doesn't last long when the truth is this ugly. The web she spun was beginning to tremble. The attackers may have vanished into the crowd, but they had left behind more than just a wounded child. They left trails, bloodstains, witnesses, and most importantly, mistakes. In their frantic escape, Lo Ka-ho was caught on a street surveillance camera, changing clothes near a local school. For a brief moment, his face was fully visible. That single frame became the crack in their plan. Police moved fast. Within hours, they were tracing movements, cross-checking mobile records, and following the threads of phone calls. Tang Ka-Fi's number lit up again and again, always connected to Lo and to another teenager, Chan Ho-Yin. The web was unraveling, one name at a time. Detectives followed the trail to a getaway vehicle, identifying the driver as Ngai Tak-wing, who was later found to have received cash for his role. A full team was now assembled in the shadows, from planners to enforcers, all under the command of a woman who claimed she just wanted peace at home. 7 days after the attack, the case exploded across borders. Police in Hong Kong coordinated with authorities in Shenzhen, where Tang Kofei had already fled. He was arrested at a restaurant in Luohu, unsuspecting, mid-meal. That same night, Lo Ka-ho was tracked down to an apartment and taken in without resistance. And just like that, the silence broke. In custody, Lo cracked. He confessed everything. The plan. The money. The orders. And most damning of all, he named Man Yee. She wasn't just aware of the attack. She had orchestrated it, paid for it, and had tried to disappear behind the chaos. But there was no hiding now. The house of cards was falling. The courtroom was filled with quiet tension, no shouting, no chaos, just the weight of disbelief. Reporters lined the benches. Families held their breath. And at the center of it all sat Man Yee, no longer hidden behind whispers or shadows. The stepmother who once faded into the background now stood before the law, her cold gaze giving nothing away. Her co-conspirators arrived in cuffs: Tang Kofei, the bitter ex-boyfriend turned planner, Lo Ka-ho and Chan Ho Yin, the teenagers who had carried out the attack, and Ngai Tak-wing, the man behind the wheel. One by one, they were called to speak. And one by one, the pieces fell into place. Lo Ka-ho's confession was clear, emotionless. He described the money, the instructions, the role he played. He didn't ask for forgiveness. He didn't offer regret. He simply told the truth. Chan Ho Yin, young and visibly shaken, admitted his part too. Their honesty didn't erase what they had done, but it opened the door to leniency. The court took their youth into account. Lo received 15 years. Chan was given 9. Tang Kofei, as the primary organizer, was sentenced to 18 years and 8 months, his calm demeanor in court doing nothing to lighten the judgment. And then it was Man Yee's turn. Her defense argued mental distress, postpartum depression, emotional instability, a woman abandoned by the man she trusted. But the psychological evaluation was clear: she had no mental illness. Only resentment. Only cruelty masked as helplessness. The judge didn't hold back. Her crime was not impulsive. It was planned, precise, and personal. She had used money and manipulation to turn children into weapons. In the end, Man Yee was sentenced to 12 years in prison. 12 years for orchestrating the destruction of a child's future. 8 years later, on the very same date the attack had taken place, Man Yee was quietly released from prison. No cameras. No headlines. Just silence. She did not return to the Chan family. Instead, she began a new life, found a new partner, became pregnant again, and eventually divorced Chan Wei's son. She gave up custody of her son without resistance. And just like that, she vanished from their world. But not everything disappeared. Chan Ho Yin, the boy at the center of it all, survived. The physical damage to his arm would never fully heal, but his spirit endured. Against all odds, he grew stronger, not just in body, but in heart, and surprisingly, perhaps even beautifully, the bond between him and his half-brother remained unbroken. The sins of one generation didn't poison the next. Still, the wounds ran deep, not only in flesh, but in trust. Families across Hong Kong watched this case unfold and saw themselves in the shadows. The jealousy. The quiet resentment. The emotional neglect that festers behind polite smiles. This wasn't just about one woman's hatred, it was about what happens when pain goes unheard for too long. Justice was served, but peace. Peace is harder to measure. Because some scars never show. They live in the silence after the courtroom empties. In the memories replayed at night. In the question that never fully fades: how could anyone do this to a child? This story is more than crime. It is a warning. A mirror. A call to protect the innocence we too often take for granted. Because no child, no matter who they belong to, should ever be caught in the crossfire of adult cruelty.